Well, welcome everybody. You had to listen a lot this morning. Now we are able to talk. So please use this opportunity to make this a very interactive debate. I kick off in 1 minute and then I open the floor for questions. I think we saw a lot of positive change this morning. I was very excited by the onco and by the dengue and by the MDR TB initiatives. So I think there's a lot of good news. But we also know, because you work in this space, that there are a lot of challenges. And the world is changing. There is the patient first initiative. There's payers who change their attitudes. There's a lot of emphasis on NCDs. So is this a threat for NTDs or not? All these questions will probably pop up during the next 40 minutes. So what does this mean for NTDs? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? We are always from a positive side. So what can we learn from each other? I think you in the audience have the opportunity to ask questions and learn from each other. And that's how I like to make this debate interactive over the next 40 minutes. So I'd like to open the floor, and please mention your name and an organization you're working for. Is there anybody who likes to kick it off? I know that's always a bit hard. Yeah, please stand up. Please stand up, please, yeah.
My name is Paul Saunderson from American Leprosy Missions, and I'd like to ask about the last talk, which is uppermost in our minds, about the access to medicine index. And I wondered why, if there is any sort of target being set by anybody, because on the graph the numbers go up to about 3.8 or so as the top. Is that 3.8 out of 5 or 3.8 out of 100?
Good question.
Grouped at the bottom, are there targets where people are aiming at?
First of all, it's a relative ranking, yeah, so it's not an absolute ranking. The 5 is the maximum, so it's 3.8 out of 5. So even for the number 1, there's still room for improvement. We also see the top 7 companies as the leaders. So it's not that number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 doesn't bring a lot to the table. And the number 1 GSK is not number 1 in every technical area. So the whole idea is that we highlight best practice so companies can learn from each other. And why are number 2 Johnson & Johnson and 3 Sanofi doing these NTD initiatives, and why are maybe others at the bottom of the list not doing it? But there was one person mentioned the Japanese GHIT initiative. So the Japanese companies are at the bottom. But due to the index, and that's written in The Economist, they were inspired to do more, and they started this initiative with the government and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I think you can use the index in your favor if you have an interesting project to show that they can get credit. Yeah? Sorry to answer the first question. Wim, you want to add?
A bit, the most important thing is that the companies, they differ a lot in their policies and practices, and some companies just get away with that, and other companies don't get the credits they deserve. And it's very necessary to know who is doing what and to compare these companies. So the first what we do is not really, we cannot say this is maximum and this is neither, but we just say you differ, take care, there's a lot to win for companies who are lower than number 1. And even for number 1, some investors, they are visited by Andrew Whitty. And then investors say to Andrew Whitty, listen Andrew, I saw your number 1 rating in the index, but I see that in quite some areas you're number 1, not number 1 yet. So what are you going to do about it? Okay?
Yeah, and Mr. Gates is chairing once a year a roundtable where he also uses our data to ask a few questions to the CEOs. So maybe other questions, maybe not to me necessarily as his chair. Who likes to go next? I know it's nice weather outside, but I'm not going to let you go earlier.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this is Luis Belel from GSK Tres Cantos. I was just thinking about what Wim presented in terms of the mechanisms that could help foster further activities in drug discovery and development. And one of the proposals was that maybe patent extensions or extension of the exclusivity periods could be a mechanism to achieve this increased involvement. But I was wondering if this could backfire in terms of early stage collaboration, because then this could lead to a situation where we would treat these diseases in the same way as we are treating other therapy areas, and maybe stop these networks that we are seeing now arising in the field.
Yeah, I think we have to be sophisticated about this, and I see the threat or the possible threat, but I think ultimately it will have to be a basket of push and pull mechanisms, and even the transferable exclusivity to other products in the market is a pull mechanism. So I don't think, and the second part of the answer I would want to propose is that all these initiatives, of course, should not come to the exact same level as the commercial revenue. This is just helping to make it happen, which doesn't mean that we would have exactly the same targets as in the commercial part of our R&D business. So I don't necessarily see the threat if it is all proportionally designed with push and pull mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wim. Who likes to go next? Yeah, gentleman in the front.
It's Martin Hibbert at the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine. I've got a question for the Sanofi group. I'm very interested to see that there's a dengue vaccine on the horizon, and keen to see such a large amount of investment in that as well. And just wondering, there's a lot of talk about antibody enhancement issues with this particular vaccine. I wondered whether you wanted to talk something about that.
We were just discussing this a moment ago. I mean, I'm sure, as you know, it's a phenomenon that's been observed in vitro for some decades, and clinically it's been something observed also for decades, particularly in some Cuban studies. We see no evidence of that in our trial. And as I mentioned during my presentation, we have a safety database of 41,000 subjects. 30,000 of those have received at least one dose, and in fact, the majority of them have received 2 doses. And as you saw, we're eliciting balanced neutralization responses to all 4 serotypes. But the safety profile is consistently good, and the follow-up that we're committed to is 5 years after our 3rd dose. So at the moment, the safety profile is very reassuring.
Now we'll ask one question in between. Wim, you talked about incentives, and we just had a question about the push and pull. I think these incentives are key to get this moving. So I'd like to hear maybe from others in this panel, what incentives do you see are needed to progress the pipeline? Anybody who would like to go first in the panel? Yes, sure.
Yeah, so one of the bizarre things that we find working closely with industry is that academics are driven by publications. That's their recognition of their achievement. And the problem is that's not the driver of the pharmaceutical industry, right, generally speaking. Although GSK, I have to say, is pushing us to publish as much as we possibly can in an open manner. So we hope to publish a screen against the 3 kinetoplastids soon, such that others can work on it. But sometimes one has to recognize that there are different drivers, right, between academic partners and industry partners, and that's certainly worth thinking about. How do you deal with that issue?
Yeah, I think that became clear to me this morning as well. So who else in the panel likes to reflect on this driver incentive question?
Yeah, just from the point of view of a European project, there is, we don't have big pharma in our project. We have academics and we have SMEs. And there is a disconnect between the SME and the academics that we're trying to solve. Basically, there's a disconnect as well on the conception of what should be protected under IP for a neglected parasitic disease. example, whereas the SME wants to protect their compounds, but the academics don't think that it's a way forward necessarily. So this is something we have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. I had a talk about. Yeah, sorry. There's a question in the back. Let's continue with the audience. Yeah, sure. Comments are also welcome.
Jane McDougall from Photomics in Paris, France. We're an SME. We're collaborating on an FP7 project on neglected infectious diseases. And I'd like to say that our experience is the complete opposite from the one that Raymond's just suggested, because our problems with patents and protecting come from the academics, and all our SME partners say there is no value in that, but we can progress our techniques. So I'm just saying I don't agree. Okay.
Yeah, please, Nicholas.
Yeah. Maybe give you a perspective from Sanofi Pasteur R&D, give you the R&D perspective. It's kind of equation I was just jotting down to make sure I get the equation right. The incentives are really fourfold. First and foremost, it's, we're a bunch of scientists within a company, so unmet medical need is a major driver for vaccine R&D. Right. Proof of concept, the fundamental feasibility and scientific rationale needs to be extremely robust. That's a key incentive for us to move forward. Another major incentive is that vaccines in particular are very capital rich. So the investment has to start very, very early compared to small molecules because there's such a long lead time for you to produce a vaccine. So sharing the risk because of that capital-rich upfront investment is very important for vaccines. And a fourth incentive is making sure that you can put the point of attrition extremely early so that you can stop the development of something that is not moving forward well as early as possible.
Right.
So the proof of concept, finding a way to have that extremely early is a major incentive. So when you put those four factors together, that's what's going to drive the decision to move forward with resources and experimentation and anything new from a vaccine perspective.
Very clear set of criteria. You'd like to comment as well?
Yes, I do tend to agree that university IP officers tend to overvalue intellectual property. And we've struggled with this at the University of Dundee, but we think we have the solution with GSK, which basically involves patenting around a very small area of chemical space such that we can guarantee the development of our molecules without being restrictive on others. So we've come to a sort of minimum position to guarantee that we can control the development of molecules without trying to be exclusive. Because the principle, as far as I'm concerned, on patenting is it is supposed to be an enabling technology, i.e. to help get products to market. Unfortunately, intellectual property is often used as a disabling or trying to obstruct competitors getting to market. And that's, to me, that's the wrong idea behind intellectual property. But I'm sure there are lots of other people who would like to debate that particular area.
And look to the left. Anybody on the left wants to comment on this? No? In the audience? I know IP can be a very sensitive issue, and I hear different approaches also among academics. I think it is an interesting topic. I know the open source is one of the topics later today, so that could maybe be in the panel discussion there as well. Any other questions? Yeah, lady here. Sorry, I can do it later.
Hello, Cynthia Sung from Duke NUS Graduate Medical School in Singapore. This question is for Mr. Munchin. You mentioned that Oxfam and MSF have different policies on IP. Could you explain what those differences are and perhaps what you think is the better model?
Yeah, well, Wim mentioned it, but maybe you answer it, maybe, Wim.
Well, I don't know. Definitely. I just wanted to know. I really don't know the difference between Oxfam and MSF, but you do know that's the difference between Oxfam and MSF and the World Health Organization and the investor. I just use this as an example that all these different stakeholders differ in their opinion, so the industry get all these voices. So what should they be doing? And that's what I wanted to show.
No key point then.
Well, they are, and we have a lot of specialists who analyze all these details, and we come up with a consensus. But if you ask me the details, I don't know here. And there are so many details, but I just wanted to use it as an example that we need to give the big pharma a clear path from what we want from them. Is that okay? But if you look in the report, it's in your, you get it today. Then you'll see that we have this information detailed. But I don't think, I'm afraid, not the difference between MSF and Oxfam. Okay.
Yeah, I could comment a little bit on it. You have this debate, a bit black and white, between patents are good and patents are bad. Delinkage, so everything should be open source. And our approach is that patents are not necessarily wrong, because otherwise we don't have innovation, because you need to protect your R&D. It's more what you do with the patents and how you share it and license your patents. And that's our whole approach, whether you lobby against TRIPS, flexibilities, all these things are in our report. So that's our approach more in general.
I mean, and we see from all these stakeholders, inclusive NGOs, that patents are not a real seen as the big barrier anymore. More and more you see that, yeah, I think I can state it here.
You had a question or remark?
I just had another comment regarding the incentives, which certainly applies to onchocerciasis and lymphatic filariasis. Alan mentioned that many of the anti-helminthic drugs come from the veterinary industry. So there is a direction back to, and we think, for example, an anti-Wolbachia treatment would be a very good treatment for heartworm.
Right.
There's a big market for heartworm because it's a parasite of cats and dogs, and there's a big market, and there's ivermectin resistance. So a business model could look at developing a drug for onchocerciasis and then making your profit from it, from the heartworm market. And there may be other examples. I don't know if the trypanosome area is
well, the NMT,
not so much of a market, I suppose.
Actually, the NMT inhibitor I showed is now under clinical trials for the treatment of cancer. So parasitologists can give back as well as take from the cancer field.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting idea that you have other returns, not necessarily for the prime disease you're focusing on. Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Any questions from the audience? I see a lady at the back waving.
Helen Price from Keele University. I had two questions for Alan regarding leishmaniasis research. Should we as a community be putting more resources into new methods for drug delivery? And secondly, should we be doing more screening for cutaneous forms of leishmaniasis, as this is becoming more of a neglected of the neglected tropical diseases?
Yes, thank you very much for that. Drug delivery, well, ideally, the target, we set out with an ideal target product profile, which is defined in collaboration with the end users, the clinicians, the public-private partnerships like DNDi, so that from the outset, we know what the ideal might be. And it may be during development we have to change that. For example, there is a discussion whether we need to use a prodrug approach for some of the molecules we're working on. But ideally, we've got to come up with delivery mechanisms that are simple, affordable, safe, practical in resource-poor settings, because these diseases are endemic in the poorest of the poor regions of the world. So that's very important. Cutaneous leishmaniasis, yes, we keep wondering about cutaneous leishmaniasis, but I think the strategy at the moment is let's tackle the second biggest parasitic killer disease, visceral leishmaniasis, first, and maybe we can piggyback onto cutaneous leishmaniasis afterwards. So we stay we have debated this, but we stay very focused on visceral leishmaniasis for the time being.
Thank you, Alan. Did that answer your question? Thank you. There is a question here in the middle. Yeah. Oh, first the lady in the back. Ladies first.
Thank you. My name is Martine Gliba. I work for a French foundation that is called Fondation Mérieux. And I have a question to most of you. I suppose when you are working on the development of new tools on neglected tropical diseases, you are collaborating with African research institutes. And I just wanted to know if it's easy for you to identify these qualified African partners or not. And I ask this question because our foundation is involved in a European Foundation initiative where we support and strengthen African research capacities. And we wanted to know if the industry knows or if there could be a need for better helping you identifying qualified African partners for doing together research on new tools.
Thank you for your
and
question.
Maybe a second question, if it's possible. You told us that the pricing is one of the most of the challenges for access to new tools at the pricing, but also the distribution. And I wanted to know if you as industry are also involved in strengthening health systems in Africa in order to improve these countries to better distribute your new products also to the most rural level. Thank you.
Nice questions. Thank you very much. Anybody on the African partners who has experience with this? Wim?
Yeah, I might take this. I think from our HIV research, we had a lot of interactions with African partners also to conduct the studies. In the TB field, I think it's very appropriate to say that capacity is a limiting factor, and especially I'm a little bit afraid if we have a lot of parallel projects going on or that will start, that we will soon run into serious troubles because the capacity isn't there, especially in a field that hasn't seen much research with new tools in 40 years or even longer. So I think any help we can get there in capacity building definitely would help. Would be great.
Who sees the same challenges in Africa? Mark?
It's a very complex question. Working in the oldest school of tropical medicine certainly helps because we have long history and extensive links with a variety of different laboratories and academic institutes in Africa. But it's maintaining and driving that capacity to be involved in this process is always a challenge and something which does need attention. There's also the capacity of being able to do trials under the situation where many of these are subject to mass drug administration programs, and so there will become fewer and fewer areas where it's possible to do trials, and so that's going to be a potential barrier in the future, I think.
Thank you, Mark.
Can I add something?
Yes, sure.
Because
Please
it just triggered something with me. Very often also, if we want to do research in the field, in the most in the areas that we don't have an established development network, I think we need to do it in partnerships for sure. But then there is very often also a different agenda. If we, and I refer to it in my presentation for the phase 3, we have to stick to rigorous regulatory criteria with our studies, and other partners often don't have those have the same agenda or the same constraints, or look at it from a much more real life situation, and we have to find common ground to be able to work together there. So flexibility from both sides would also help a lot to make that a more efficient collaboration.
Yeah, so it is a real issue, and well, I think you all have to make the best out of it. Who's dealing with the second question on strengthening health systems? Maybe who has experience with that? I know some companies do, but not familiar. I know Johnson is doing a lot in India and China. So maybe Wim, you want to talk about it a little bit, but yeah, you can do it now straight.
Yes, I think the way we look at our global public health initiatives and the role we need to play there, as I explained or try to explain in the presentation, is not just about the compounds that we're developing. We want to look at it from a much more holistic point of view. It helps, of course, to be part of a healthcare company, probably the biggest healthcare company if you combine consumer with the pharma sector and then diagnostics and devices as well, that you have a very broad scope and you can contribute a lot because the expertise is very wide. But that's how we want to look at it. I think we also look at how should we be measured for success. And for me, the drug ending up in a pharmacy, regardless what it is completely irrelevant if it doesn't get to the patient. So although that last mile very often is not something that we have under control, but what we can do, and often works, I think, in partnerships, is be brokers and bring different expertises together. Also, where you refer to supply chain expertise, we can also bring that to the table, but I think we need to go for partners and tap on the specific expertise they have and not do everything ourselves or try to do everything ourselves. There are other people better placed. But to have that community, to build that community and to see it not as distinct phases of the chain, but that is as important for when you bring a new tool that you keep in mind, is it really going to end up at the patient level, and feel committed for that and work in partnerships to make that happen.
Yeah, sure.
The question, I was trying to think very broadly, but maybe I can give a very practical example. And I use dengue, but in fact it's applicable for probably most vaccines as they get later in development, but not early. In order to pull off a large clinical program, you have to put in place the infrastructure, which often doesn't exist in the regions that we're talking about. So what does that mean? For example, in dengue, we had to put in place 22 sites across South America, 12 sites across Asia. Some of those sites literally have no buildings, so those buildings have to be created, the facilities have to be put in place, people have to be trained, they have to remain compliant, you have to go through the process of managing samples according to local legislation, and that doesn't go away. When the trial is finished, that remains in the community for use. And of course, also when you get later in development, applicable for drugs as well as vaccines, you need the surveillance for safety, and we've talked about safety. After licensure, long-term safety surveillance is absolutely critical. So what the industry does spend a lot of money and effort on is making sure that the surveillance is in place in countries so that you can monitor the disease and the performance of the drug over a long period of time. And that also doesn't go away after the drug is developed.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges, and I think you're talking about pharmacovigilance there as well. Yeah, I know in Africa that's a challenge as well, although it is improving. When we did our stakeholder consultation in Ghana, we spoke with the pharmacovigilance people. So there's a lot of challenges in Africa, that's for sure. Yeah, sure.
It's actually a question to the two participants at the end of the table. Will both it's off. Yeah, there it is. Okay, sorry. You're both involved with providing a certain technology, applying a certain type of technology to, let's say, finding drug targets. You've both been involved in finding drug targets, or in this case, in your case, pathways that could be potentially exploited as a drug target. Would there be plans, the question is, would there be plans to become fully integrated to product, go down the FIBC route and end up with a product? Will you remain, as a service provider or a building block in the consortium, or would you go all the way to product? I'm asking that to Edith as well as Louise and Jose separately.
Thank you.
I think it's one of those very difficult questions. I think from experience, we tend to be very much more upstream, and the way that we actually function is as a facility. that we have, in a sense, we have customers who come to us. So we provide a service, although because we're an academic institution, it's very much more than a service, it's a collaboration. So as far as products go, to a certain extent, we don't particularly have a stake in them. We sort of facilitate the action, and then it would be our customer, if you're going to call them customer, who would then maybe go on to have collaborations with industry. We have limited collaborations with mostly SMEs, but on the whole our collaborators are academic, and it's then the academics who then would go on to make, you know, sort of the further collaborations. You know, although in the past I have sort of worked on more, I suppose, downstream academic projects. We've done quite a lot of work on HIV, but the way that we work now is probably no, would be the answer to your question.
Edith, could I ask you the same question? In terms of you're part of a larger structure, it's not just hygienic services, there are aspects to your business, so would that be something that you do?
So, depending on the project we are working on, the picture is a bit different. For the use to hybrid technology, as our input is more earlier in the research program, our main partners or customers are from academics. And for the YKMH, for targets, identification of small molecules, we work mainly with industry. We are a service provider, but of course we are collaborating in several kind of grants to have to add a large input on the project, but so it depends. Every project is managed differently.
Yeah. Thank you. Jose?
A quick word I have is that we act as a hub in the whole process. Anyway, what I can see that can be that we can contribute quite a lot is that we can most likely provide exactly that robust proof of concept type position for somebody that is working on a project. So like that we can direct our users in that direction, I would say. I think that is the amplifying type effect, that we get people that wouldn't otherwise be doing that suddenly they can be doing that.
I think that's what I was trying to say as well, is that, to echo what Jose says, is that we're facilitators. We facilitate other people's work through our technical expertise.
And it also depends of the expectation of the partners. Sometimes they want only us to do the job, and sometimes they expect more to give the maximum we can to make their program to progress. So it really depends.
Thank you. Yeah, we only have time for one last question, so please go ahead.
From the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. We've heard some nice examples of how big companies are working in the NTD space. We've also heard that it's difficult for them to make the case internally and keep applying the resources. So when we look across the industry, there's a greater move to pre-competitive sharing of information and working together. What do you think are the opportunities, and what will be the catalysts to increase the collaborations between companies working together rather than working on projects on their own or with an academic group?
Thank you very much for this very nice question, which is very relevant. So who likes to respond on this? Mark?
I can give a specific example for macrofluoricides. The Gates Foundation have developed a macrofluoricide drug accelerator consortium, which is based on their TB drug accelerator program. And this is where they bring academia and pharma together, and they've streamlined the process to get agreement, and that has, I believe, resulted in pharma working together much more together than in competitive situation. So that's one example which I think tries to solve that problem.
Nicholas, you also want to comment?
I'll try and give you a general response, also having worked for some time at Pfizer in the United States. It's actually quite a simple answer. Companies often struggle with opportunity cost, which means you can do it, but you've got to take it from somewhere else. So really the success I've seen in bringing large multinational companies together is dealing with that opportunity cost, and that is sharing risk. And it does sound very simple, but if you can get companies together and with a common understanding of that opportunity cost for a given disease, then you can bring them together. And one of the good examples that I've had the opportunity to work on was between Pfizer and Janssen on Alzheimer's disease, which is an extremely tough target. I know that's not a tropical, not relevant for this Congress, but it is a good example of where the opportunity cost and the shared risk really brought those two companies together.
Okay, well, thank you all for participating in this panel. There's one thing I'd like to mention at the end, which hasn't mentioned the whole morning yet, and it's still relevant, I think. Some of you will remember the London Declaration, signed in 2012. It's also called Uniting to Combat Neglected Tropical Diseases. There's a scorecard. There's also a scorecard on pipelines. This is driven by the Gates Foundation, but also there's 13 companies participating. So I would strongly encourage you to look at this program if you have relevant projects in this sphere, because you could get maybe funding through this channel. So thank you all, and thank you for asking the questions. And I give it back to Kareem. Where are you?